Today is September 2nd, 2025. I apologize for my absence. I was ill. I have been resting and recovering. I feel much better now. I want to thank everyone who has inquired about my well-being. I really appreciate that. I am now getting back to business. I will talk about 3 countries targeted by US regime change right now, at this moment: Venezuela, Serbia, and Indonesia. These are on 3 of the 4 corners of the globe, if you will. And this is a continuation of US regime change operations taking place throughout the entirety of the 21st century. The Trump administration now is continuing not just the regime change operations it had been presiding over during Trump's first administration, but it is continuing operations that were ongoing under the previous Biden administration and operations that stretch all the way back to the Bush Jr. administration and even further beyond that. But just for the sake of simplicity, we will confine this discussion to the 21st century. We will begin with Venezuela. The United States is threatening the Latin American nation of Venezuela. It is headed by President Nicolas Maduro. The United States has sought to overthrow the Venezuelan political establishment there since President Hugo Chavez was in power. And as a matter of fact, temporarily, the U.S. succeeded in doing so. And this was under the administration of George Bush Jr. This continued all under the Obama administration, the first Trump administration. There was another major attempt to overthrow the political order there. And now we are back to openly menacing Venezuela. The United States is openly menacing Venezuela with military force. And we will start with this CBS News article. U.S. guided missile cruiser spotted crossing the Panama Canal after warships deployed to Venezuela. And I hear a lot of people talking about how, well, we're not for U.S. regime change and military interventions overseas, but this is absolutely justified because Venezuela, as the Trump administration has said, and we haven't bothered to fact check this ourselves, the president of Venezuela, the entire government of Venezuela are involved in narco-terrorism. They are flooding America with illicit narcotics. This is what the CBS News article says. U.S. guided missile cruiser, USS Lake Erie, was seen crossing the Panama Canal from the Pacific to the Caribbean on Friday night. This is now Tuesday as I'm recording this, after the Trump administration deployed warships near the coast of Venezuela. The United States has said the deployment of warships to the southern Caribbean near Venezuela's territorial waters was an anti-drug trafficking operation. I will get into the irony and absurdity of this comment in just a moment. Washington has accused Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro of leading a drug cartel and has doubled the bounty for his capture to $50 million. The United States is putting bounties on the heads of national leaders. Imagine if any other nation in the world was acting like this, how the U.S. itself would react, unless the U.S. was using these nations as a client state and as an extension of America's own foreign policy. The U.S. has, however, made no public threat to invade Venezuela. When do they ever? They always use some sort of pretext to do these sort of things. Caracas announced on Monday the deployment of 15,000 security forces to the Colombian border for anti-drug trafficking operations. A day later, Venezuela announced that it would patrol its territorial waters with drones and Navy ships. Maduro also claimed to have mobilized more than 4 million militia members in response to what he called outlandish threats, and this is in quotation marks for some reason, by the U.S. Thousands of civil servants, housewives, and retirees lined up in Venezuela's capital last weekend to join the country's militia. Since returning to power in January, President Trump's attacks on Venezuela have focused chiefly on its powerful gangs, some of which operate inside the United States. But his policy of maximum pressure on Venezuela, including an oil embargo still in effect, failed to dislodge Maduro from power. Last year, the U.S. seized a plane belonging to Maduro and brought it to the U.S. So they admit right here, failed to dislodge Maduro from power. So it is about regime change. Maybe it's not about outright invasion, but this is absolutely about regime change and has nothing to do with illicit narcotics. And I'll get to that in just a moment. And it is President Trump himself, his entire administration, that have, without a shred of doubt, confirmed that this has nothing to do with illicit narcotics. But I just want to prove to you here for a moment that this is continuity of agenda. This has nothing to do with President Trump finishing unfinished business from his first term. No, this continued all 4 years during the previous Biden administration. And we know that because NPR had this article out in 2024. And so the last year of the Biden administration, Biden reinstates sanctions on Venezuela. So everything the first Trump administration put into place was built on by the following Biden administration. And now President Trump is picking right up where not his first administration left off, but where the Biden administration had left off. And this article says, last October, so remember this is early 2024, the US and Venezuela cut a deal at a meeting in Barbados. Venezuela agreed to take steps towards holding a free and fair presidential election. When the US uses terms like this, it means an election that creates an outcome that suits US foreign policy objectives. It has nothing to do with an actual free and fair election. In exchange, the US lifted crippling oil sanctions that had been in place since 2019. An election has been scheduled for July 28. However, Nicolas Maduro, Venezuela's authoritarian president, has continued to oppress his opponent, says Eric Farnsworth of the Council of America's think tank in Washington. And as always is the case, and this is why nothing changes no matter who you vote into office, all of these think tanks are the ones actually driving these narratives, these agendas, and foreign policy, regardless of whether it's a conservative or liberal president in the White House, and regardless of who controls Congress. This is the Council of the Americas, referred to in that previous NPR article, who funds them. And, you know, an easy way to do this is it's 26 pages long. Instead of reading the entire annual report, you just hit Control F and just take a wild guess. Boeing, for example. Oh, hey, there's Boeing. That's one of the people leading this think tank is also a ranking member in the Boeing company. As a matter of fact, Boeing is listed here several times. They're also a corporate sponsor. Let's see who else is here. Bayer, BlackRock, Citigroup, Chiquita Brands, that goes all the way back to American corporate plundering of Latin America over a century ago. Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan, Microsoft Corporation, Pfizer, PepsiCo, MasterCard, Microsoft, and Open Society, George Soros's Open Society. So isn't it comforting for Trump supporters who think this is about deposing a socialist or a communist or a Marxist dictator in Latin America? Isn't it comforting that they are all on the same page as a corporate financier and also Soros-funded think tank who agree with them that Venezuela's government needs to be overthrown? It has nothing to do with political ideology. It's all about American primacy. It is about these handful of corporations expanding their power and primacy over the planet at the expense of absolutely everyone else. Not just the people in Venezuela that will suffer from constant American sanctions, political interference, threats of military force, and then inevitably actual military force, but also the American people themselves who benefit nothing from their tax dollars being pilfered to build empire abroad while their country rots out from under them. So I just thought it's important for you to see these are the interests that drive US foreign policy, no matter who is in power. This agenda laid out explicitly in this NPR article during the Biden administration has now been accelerated under the current Trump administration. Now let's get back to how absurd this claim is, that this is a justified military operation and these threats to Venezuela, the idea of regime change in Venezuela is somehow justified because it's a narco-terrorist state threatening America, its actual security within its borders, by flooding the borders with illicit narcotics. Let's just see how absolutely, utterly absurd, according to President Trump himself, that claim is. And we go to the White House itself, the Trump White House, April 28, 2025, promises made, promises kept, all in capitals because you're a child and they want to really impress upon you that this is super important. Border security achieved in fewer than 100 days. So there's already border security. There's already absolute airtight border security in the United States. And if you talk to a Trump supporter, they will tell you, President Trump has fixed the problem on the border. No more immigration. Breitbart told me, Newsmax told me, Fox News told me the border is secured. And it says in this White House statement, since President Donald J. Trump took office, he and his administration have ushered in the most secure border in modern American history, and he didn't need legislation to do it. President Trump has made good on the promise he made on the campaign trail to usher in an unprecedented era of homeland security. Promise made, all capitals again. We will close the border. We will stop the invasion of illegals into our country. And then all in capitals again. Promise kept. Illegal border encounters are down by 95%. Illegal immigration gotaways, the top threat to public safety, are down by 99%. Amazing, incredible. The border is just sealed. No more illegal immigration. The threat of illegal aliens overrunning America has been solved. And then there's an extensive list of news articles spanning the spectrum, liberal and conservative news outlets. Migrants arrest at US-Mexican border in March, lowest ever recorded. How Trump's hardline tactics are driving down migration. That's the New York Times saying that. Border crossings plunged to lowest levels in decades, new data. Under Trump, border catch and release has dropped 99.999% from worst Biden month. Canada-Mexico border, once overwhelmed, now nearly empty. Incredible, incredible achievement. So then you have to ask yourself, if the Trump administration is saying the border is secured while simultaneously saying Nicolas Maduro of Venezuela is flooding America with illicit narcotics, demanding a military response, how could that conceivably be true? How could that possibly be true? If the border is sealed, the homeland is secure, how are illicit narcotics still flooding into the United States? Nobody asks these questions because they are not in a state of objective, critical thinking. They are in a state of ideological obsession. People who hate President Trump hate him, regardless of what he does, and people who love President Trump and support him no matter what he says, and no matter what he does, and no matter how contradictory anything he says in reality actually is. Saying the border is secured and that this threat has been eliminated while simultaneously using the flood of illicit narcotics into the country from Venezuela as a pretext for military force used against Venezuela, or at least the threat of it being used against Venezuela. The Trump administration is lying about at least one of these two things, although almost certainly lying about both. And if you dig into these articles, and most people don't, they just read the headlines and draw the conclusions they want to draw. If you dig into these articles, you will see the statistic gymnastics used to portray the border as having been sealed. And if you look at illegal immigration, it goes up and down all 4 years of every president's administration. There are high points, there are low points, and what the opposing sides in the theater that is American left-right politics, they will cherry pick months where it's extraordinarily high for their opponents, and they will cherry pick points during their administration where it's extraordinarily low, and that's how they will make their comparison. And they know Americans are never going to actually look at the timeline and see how it goes up and down without any rhyme or reason in regards to the policies they themselves publicly announce. How are Venezuelan drugs getting into the United States if the border is sealed? Is President Nicolas Maduro using some sort of Star Trek technology where he's directly beaming it into the United States and it just is bypassing this airtight border? Is that what is happening? This White House statement actually goes even further. It talks specifically about the drug gangs and how they have been decimated inside the United States. So let's go over some of it. We will expel, so this is the promise made, again, all capitals. We will expel every single illegal alien gang member and migrant criminal operating on American soil and remove the savage gang Tren de Argua, I don't speak Spanish, I'm sure I am not pronouncing that correctly, from the United States. And these are gangs that he is specifically linking to Venezuela right now. President Trump designated this gang, MS-13, and other vicious gangs and cartels as foreign terrorist organizations, which is interesting. He's listing these drug cartels as foreign terrorist organizations while simultaneously taking Al-Qaeda in Syria off the foreign terrorist organization list. But of course, if Breitbart and Newsmax and Fox News never reported that that happened in the minds of Trump supporters, it didn't happen. Department of Justice, 27 members of associates of Tren de Argua charged with racketeering, narcotics, sex trafficking, robbery, and firearms offenses. Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem, under President Trump, we have arrested over 150,000 aliens, including more than 600 members of the vicious Tren de Argua gang. The Trump administration directed the successful apprehension of a key MS-13 gang leader, an illegal immigrant living in Virginia and operating as one of the top 3 MS-13 leaders in the US. And it just goes on and on and on about how they have decimated these illegal drugs, sex trafficking, violent gangs, how they've been eradicated from the borders of America and how the borders themselves have been sealed. So again, how are the illicit narcotics flooding the country at the same time? It does not add up. It simply does not make sense. You cannot have one happening while the other is a reality. It is impossible. The drugs are not walking in on their own. They're also not selling themselves to the American public. So who is still doing it? That is the question people should be asking themselves. President Trump is at least lying about one of these things, but most likely lying about both of these things. So I already talked about how this is just a continuation of what took place under the previous Biden administration, and then again, how that was just building on what President Trump did during his first administration, how this is all a continuation of what George Bush Jr. and Barack Obama did over their respective 8 years in office. This is a continuation of US regime change operations targeting Latin America that have spanned decades and decades, and of course, all throughout the previous century and the entirety of the 21st century. So this is about continuity of agenda. This is about the US maintaining primacy over all of the Americas, the entire Western Hemisphere. The US assumes dominion over it, and they do not want any nation with an independent foreign or domestic policy within this hemisphere. This is something that the US would say Russia doing in Europe or China doing in the Asia-Pacific region is unacceptable. They're not allowed to be the preeminent power in their region of the planet. That is wrong. All nations should have sovereignty. But in the Western Hemisphere, the US assumes dominion over all, and the US assumes dominion over all other regions of the planet as well. That is what is taking place in regards to this military ramp up by the US vis-a-vis Venezuela. There is no justification for this. The justification itself is completely contradictory to everything else the current Trump administration has said, everything the Western media, liberal and conservative, have said about the situation along the border, according to the White House itself. And so what we are being presented with is yet another regime change war being pushed onto the American public with a pretext they think Americans will be duped into believing, at least temporarily, at least long enough to get things in motion. That is what is going on with Venezuela. And I know Trump supporters who voted for President Trump or who supported him while he was campaigning, specifically because he said he was going to end all of these wars. But just like President Bush and Obama and President Trump during his first administration, if you remember, just like they all did, that's what they promised and got people to vote for them. That's what they said to get people to vote for them on the campaign trail and during elections. But then immediately once in office, then came one war after another after another. We are not even a year into this second term of the Trump administration, and President Trump has already waged war against Yemen and Iran, and he is mobilizing forces against Venezuela, and he is continuing the US proxy war. His own administration admits is a US proxy war against Russia in Ukraine. He could have ended that on his first day in office. He has deliberately chosen not to. And now he is blaming Russia for this war, the US itself, again, according to the Trump administration itself, provoked with Russia, again, in the form of a proxy war. So we need to keep all of these things in mind regarding Venezuela. Serbia. The United States government and the Western media unanimously agrees that in the late 1990s and early 2000s, the US government built up an opposition movement inside Serbia and overthrew the government there. It was not an organic protest. It was engineered from top to bottom, completely funded and directed by the US government through the National Endowment for Democracy and adjacent private and public foundations, including George Soros's Open Society. And again, this takes place regardless of whether there's a Republican or Democrat president in the White House. And it is continuing even to this day, even with President Trump and his administration claiming to have defunded and dismantled USAID, the NED, Voice of America, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. I will show you that all of their websites are all online. They're still in operation. They're still funding regime change all around the globe, with the exception of USAID. That has been dismantled in terms of a separate structure, has been integrated under the State Department, now functions as part of the State Department. Again, that's according to the State Department itself. How do we know that the US government overthrew the government of Serbia at the turn of the 21st century? Well, the New York Times told us they did, and they cited people in the National Endowment for Democracy who admitted what they did in Serbia. Who really brought down Milosevic? This was published in November 2000. This is the New York, again, the New York Times. I'm going to read to you from this article from 25 years ago. This is what it says in the article, and then listen to how contradictory even this article is, and the requirement for critical thinking when reading Western media, because if you don't use critical thinking, they will tell you the truth. They will tell you that the US overthrew the government, but at the same time, they will convince you that it was an organic, grassroots uprising. The author of this New York Times article begins by saying, "I have traveled southward from Belgrade over bridges now repaired after NATO's 1999 bombing." Because remember, they tried to violently just bomb Serbia. And the US, through NATO and through its political capture of Europe, dismembered Yugoslavia, split it into all of these Balkanized. The word Balkanized comes from what the US and NATO did to the Balkans. Because it was not the capital that toppled Milosevic. For all the stirring images of the federal parliament in flames, okay, so we're always told that was a peaceful color revolution. All of these are always violent, and the Western media just selectively chooses not to report on the violence or emphasize the violence. Rather, his overthrow came through a provincial uprising stirred in large measure by Serbian youth acting through a grassroots movement called OPAR, which means resistance. And this is what people are insisting today. The protests in Serbia, and I will talk about Indonesia as well, the violent protests taking place there, identical protests taking place there, again, on the other side of the planet, but identical in nature. They say that these violent mobs in the streets burning their own country to the ground over things that don't justify burning your own country to the ground. They're claiming that this is a grassroots movement, that the US isn't involved in any shape, form, or way. But I'm going to prove to you that all of the groups that you can identify involved in the protests are literally funded by the US government or an adjacent private or European government-funded foundation. So that's what the New York Times says. They say these were grassroots youth-led movements. I remember being a youth. I was not capable of overthrowing a government. That is a fact. But I was capable of being influenced very easily by people with lots of money, marketing muscle, to the point where I literally joined the US Marines and I voted for George Bush Jr. It was the first and only time I ever voted in a US presidential election. And then I grew up and woke up. But that's how powerful marketing was. Political marketing, corporate marketing, it takes holds of people. And the youth especially are impressionable. That's what makes them youth. That's what I remember as being a youth, how impressionable I was. and how the process of becoming an adult is in part overcoming that impressionability, or at least picking and choosing what you allow to make an impression upon you. So then the New York Times admits, this is what they also admit in the exact same article where they labeled this grassroots. They said, American assistance to UPAR and the 18 parties that ultimately ousted Milosevic is still a highly sensitive subject because it was secret. They always do this covertly. And they're aware that if their involvement is uncovered, it will undermine the whole effort. So they will do anything required, including pretending to be anti-American, to try to push all of this through. And that is exactly what they're doing all around the globe, even to this day. Has not ended. But Paul B. McCarthy, an official with the Washington-based, and I will add US government-funded, National Endowment for Democracy, or NED, is ready to divulge some details. So the New York Times interviewed someone from the NED, and he admits that they funded absolutely everything. They did it secretly, and they will explain how. McCarthy says from August 1999, so again, in advance, years in advance, they begin preparing all of this. The dollars started to flow to UPAR pretty significantly. Of the almost $3 million spent by his group in Serbia since September 1998. So again, years, this is spanning years to prepare for this. These are not spontaneous. I always hear people say it's spontaneous. The Arab Spring was spontaneous and the US simply hijacked it. No, they didn't. They engineered it years in advance. All of the groups leading the Arab Spring crossed the entirety of the Arab world. Everywhere it erupted, the protest leaders leading it were all in the United States and Europe and Latin America, US State Department funded workshops being funded, equipped, and trained to go back to the respective countries and burn them to the ground. We see the result of all of that. The money went into UPAR accounts outside Serbia to conceal the fact that the US government was funding this grassroots youth movement. It was a US government movement, and they were using the youths as impressionable cover. At the same time, McCarthy had a series of meetings with the movement's leaders. And then they list all of these capitals outside of Serbia where they met these leaders. They met with them outside of Serbia. Secret meetings, secret funding. And then these people passed themselves off as spontaneous, organic, grassroots-driven protest leaders, when in reality they were created, funded, and directed by the US through secret money channeled to them and secret meetings where they were told what to do. Homan, at 28, one of UPAR's senior members, was one of McCarthy's interlocutors. We had a lot of financial help from Western non-governmental organizations, Homan says, and we also some Western governmental organizations that, of course, they call the NED an NGO, but it isn't. It is created by the US government, is funded by the US government, and it is overseen by the US government. So no matter how badly they want to pass it off as an NGO, a non-governmental organization, it is a US government organization. Let us continue. So, of course, the takeaway here is they meet with these people, they fund them secretly. It's very hard to trace it when it's happening. And they go through extensive measures to conceal their involvement, okay? But I will show you how to find the fingerprints of US government intervention, because there are certain groups that they have to fund that are very public, and it's very difficult to conceal funding for them, although they're working on fixing that, and I'll explain how in just a moment. So I've had people arguing with me that President Alexander Vučić of Serbia, he's horrible, he's pro-US, he's pro-NATO, he's pro-EU, and you can prove it because I read an op-ed in The Guardian, and that proves that the West, I read one op-ed in the Western media, and that proves that the West is behind President Vučić. And this is the one that they show me. Serbia cannot accept violent street protests, and their takeaway by just reading the headline, not even looking at who wrote it, and they're saying, this is proof that the West is against the violent protests, and that's how we know these are legit grassroots protests. There are no grassroots protests. There's not a single, for good or bad, there are no grassroots protests. Every single protest, good or bad, requires leadership and resources to sustain for any length of time and in any hope to achieve anything. Protests in and of themselves do not achieve anything. You need to have a circle of interest capable of exploiting whatever leverage you create with the protests themselves, which requires leadership and resources. I am in Thailand, in Southeast Asia. I have witnessed US government-funded protests here in Thailand and protests funded by Thai interests, powerful Thai interests here in Thailand, opposed to US interference inside Thailand's internal political affairs. I've seen both, and they both require huge amounts of resources and very good leadership. So this article is actually by President Alexander Vučić himself. It's a letter that The Guardian published that he wrote. And if you actually read it past the headline, it says Serbia's deep engagement with Europe is hardly consistent with the idea of it as an authoritarian and malign outliner in the region. And then they admit that this is the president writing this letter. And then what is he writing this letter in response to? An editorial in The Guardian. This is how the Western media actually feels about the protests in Serbia. They link directly to it in that that's not even an op-ed, the letter to The Guardian. It says, the Guardian view on protests in Serbia, a battle for democracy that the EU must not ignore. So that they're actually literally supporting the protests. And the president of Serbia is writing a letter to The Guardian saying, you're wrong. You're wrong about everything you wrote in that article where you're supporting these violent protesters. So anyone waving one single article around that they cherry-picked, and they didn't even bother reading it and seeing what it was in response to, and it's not to pick on these people, but this is how ordinary people decipher the unfolding geopolitical landscape. It is through a series of emotional reactions. They're not engaging their critical thinking. They're not being objective. They're being emotional, and they're simply reacting to it. If you applied critical thinking, you remained objective, and you actually analyzed what you were looking at, you would have seen that that letter to The Guardian was in response to what The Guardian's actual view of the protests were. And I'm going to read from this Guardian op-ed where they explain what the Guardian's position and, of course, the wider Western media and, of course, the corporate interests that drive the messaging and narratives of the Western media. I will read it to you so you can see. So this is what the Guardian's actual stance is on the protests. The catalyst for some of the largest demonstrations in Serbia's history since the last time the US overthrew the Serbian government was the collapse of a newly renovated railway station roof in the country's second city, Novi Sad. And I could be saying that wrong, and I apologize if I am. Leading to the deaths of 16 people. The disaster was widely attributed to entrenched fraud and corruption presided over by Mr. Vučić's ruling Serbian Progressive Party, and swiftly became the spark for a movement for democratic reform. Well, there is no such thing as Western-style democracy. It is actually a system of control masquerading as self-determination. So we know that whole concept of this sparking a movement for democratic reform is a complete lie. The students, okay, again, students who haven't even finished school and are not even actually contributing to society, somehow they know better than everybody else, including the government. They're demanding early elections, so essentially regime change, elections that the US and EU can influence, and then from the elections get the results they want, and a new era of transparency and accountability, just like in the rest of the EU, right? In what remains an EU candidate country, as anger and frustration in the streets has mounted, Mr. Vučić's response has become increasingly draconian, groundlessly claiming that foreign agitators were seeking an imported revolution. How is that groundless? The US literally admits they've already done this in Serbia once. And there is a list a mile long, and I'm going to read it to you, of all of the interference the US government is still funding right now under the Trump administration in Serbia specifically. I will show you in just a moment, and I will show you the individual groups that are receiving at least part of that money. So it says, groundlessly claiming that foreign agitators were seeking an imported revolution, and it's in quotation marks for some reason, the president launched a ruthless crackdown on civil society groups in receipt of foreign funds. Well, they're admitting that they're literally, civil society is getting foreign funds, and they're being cracked down on, and they're saying that's groundless, that there are foreign-funded organizations involved in the protests. So they're contradicting themselves in the same sentence, literally. On the streets, Orchestrated mobs this month attacked protesters and reportedly looted businesses owned by opponents of Mr. Vučić. There have been widespread reports of police brutality. Well, they admit that the protests themselves are violent. And so the police are responding with force. You have to. If people are burning the country to the ground, the police are required, it's their duty to stop people from burning the country to the ground. And if they can't, the military must. Amid the spiral of violence, one recent anti-government demonstration in Belgrade took place under the slogan, "Let's show them we're not punching bags." In other words, we're going to use violence too, or we're going to use more violence. They said that it's groundless to claim that foreign interests are involved in interfering in Serbia's internal political affairs. I'm going to show you now the list of NED organizations the US is funding specifically targeting Serbia. And you tell me, if Russia or China were funding programs like this inside the United States, whether the US would tolerate it or not. And if the answer is no, then we know that the US is willingly, knowingly doing something it understands is utterly unacceptable. It would not accept anyone doing it to them, and yet they are doing it to someone else. And they're doing it under a presidential administration that claimed that all of this would end, and yet it continues right before our very eyes. And I've heard people try to excuse the Trump administration by claiming the EU is somehow doing this all on their own. No, the NED's website is still up. I'm going to show it to you right now. I'm going to hit the refresh button so you can see that this isn't archived. It is ned.org, and this is their current website. It is still up. It is still active. They're still actively publishing new articles. We could just click on this one, and we can see this is August 1st, 2025, months after everyone declared President Trump having defunded and dismantled these organizations. It is still online and operating. The whole point of President Trump pretending to dismantle and defund these organizations was to sweep it under the carpet so nobody talked about it. So in their minds, they believed that it was gone, so that when all of this regime change continued, people would then start making excuses and blaming it on Europe, which is called plausible deniability. It's not actually not being responsible. It is creating the illusion that you're no longer responsible. So that is the NED's website. And here is the current disclosure of US government funding through the National Endowment for Democracy in Europe specifically. And of course, it's 46 pages long, and it lists every country, including nations like Belarus. The US policy papers openly admit that they're trying to overthrow countries like Belarus, Bosnia and Herzegovina. Let's continue. Kosovo. And you can see these are long lists. Moldova, that's on the check. The RAND Corporation 2019 paper extending Russia, that's on the checklist. Moldova and Belarus, they're both on the checklist. Let's continue. We'll find Serbia. Here's Serbia. I'm just going to scroll through this slowly, and I'm going to read off some of these. Promoting civic oversight of the security sector, fostering youth engagement, and they're naming regions. These are different regions. They also talk about Kosovo and inter-religious and ethnic, and it's all about creating an identity for all of these different groups within a particular country or region, creating independent identities for them so that they're opposed to one another. This Imperial divide and conquer 101, that's what they're doing. They're creating individual identities for people within a country or region, making them feel as if they're special, they're different, they're apart from everyone else. They should act independently, they should pursue independence. And then what the US does is essentially sponsor separatism. And they carve up countries just like the Roman Empire did and the British Empire after that, and as America has done ever since. Promoting professional digital journalism. That's essentially just indoctrinating people across journalism to report the way the US wants them to. Promoting accountability and civic participation in local decision making. So that these are all of the functions of self-determination, of national sovereignty, and the United States is interfering in absolutely all of them. Civic engagement in local communities. Why does the United States government get a say in that? Isn't that the business of the local communities themselves? Strengthening independent local media. This is something KJ No talks about all the time. The lexicon of modern American empire. When they say independent media, they're actually talking about US government-funded propaganda. And that is how we figure out whether a protest is US government funded or not. The US government funded independent media, which is obviously not independent. It's dependent on Washington and annual funding from Washington. And of course, all the secret meetings they obviously engage in, as the New York Times admitted to. They will be on one side or the other of a protest very vocally, because shaping the narrative and getting people on board with either promoting a protest or stopping a protest, that is how the US controls its own color revolutions and manages attempts to push back or reverse previous color revolutions. Let's continue. Strengthening independent local media, fostering public debate and independent reporting. Again, all of these claims of independence, when the whole process of funding them completely undermines the concept of independence. Strengthening civic participation in Eastern Serbia. So again, carving up Serbia. Challenging a culture of impunity for past atrocities is extremely ironic coming from the US government. Fostering youth civic engagement in promoting tolerance. And actually you will see a lot of youth engagement, civic engagement among youth. And that's where you get these youth and student protests, because they have programs specifically creating legions of young people indoctrinated by NED-funded programs in their schools, in their communities, online, through the media. And they build these armies of youths and students, and they're the ones that then go out into the street because they're impressionable. And we all remember what it's like being young and impressionable. And they're the ones that go out and they have all the energy and imprudence to burn their country down, thinking that somehow it will end in some sort of Hollywood movie style happy conclusion where the clouds break and they see the sun and they enter into a new utopian future of peace, freedom, and democracy. Well, it doesn't work out that way. Ask everyone involved in the Arab Spring. Ask Ukraine. Ask Georgia. Ask Myanmar. You see how long the list is. I'm actually not done scrolling through the list. It continues for several pages. And then they get to Ukraine. So they're still meddling in Ukraine, because it's not about just capturing a country. It's about maintaining control over the country after that. The US creates these parallel institutions, uses color revolutions to install them over the indigenous institutions of a targeted country, and then builds them up after that to make it harder and harder to reverse once they sink their hooks in. So an extensive current program of funding sedition inside Serbia. That is what all of that is. If Russia or China were funding that inside the US, it would be labeled sedition. It would be ended in a heartbeat. And yet the United States is doing this, and they're doing it very quietly. And the Trump administration itself specifically has convinced millions of Trump supporters that this isn't even taking place anymore, because he ended it, even though you can find the website online, active, and still operating. Now, you will notice that I read through that extensive list. We didn't see the name of one single organization or political party mentioned. Why is that? And I've mentioned this before. It's because of the new, announced in April 25th, 2025, again, months after the Trump administration came into power, NED's duty of care and public disclosure policies. And what they're claiming is that if people know who these groups are that they're funding, they will get in trouble. Which is obvious. I mean, they're funded by the US to carry out sedition and treason, to burn their country down, to divide it and destroy it. And of course, if people knew who these groups were and that they were being funded by the US, and that's why they were burning everything down, literally killing people in the streets, they might take issue with that. It might make it harder for the US to succeed in regime change. So what they're saying is the NED was created to transparently do what the CIA had previously done, regime change all around the world. But this transparency has kind of boomeranged back at them. And so now they are going covert again. And it's kind of the best of both worlds, because the NED still doesn't sound as bad as a CIA-sponsored uprising. But now the NED isn't being transparent at all. And you have to really, really dig to find evidence of which groups specifically are being funded. But if you know how to research properly, you will find entire lists of at least media organizations, and sometimes legal and fake human rights organizations funded by the National Endowment for Democracy. And you look and see, either on their website, if it doesn't say on their website, their X or other social media platform, they will be keeping up with current events, and you will see what their position is on any development within a specific country or even around the world for that matter. And so let's go over a list of organizations. This is called the Center for Investigative Journalism of Serbia. It says it is, if you look on their website, it says that it is a member, and of course they have all of these lists of awards that they've been given by the United States, European Union, and all the government and corporate funded foundations that the US uses to pursue primacy all around the globe, including through US sponsored regime change. So this is already extremely obvious. But it admits all of these organizations that it is a part of, including the Global Investigative Journalism Network. Okay, so then you go to that and you see, if they're not going to admit who funds them there, you go to the organizations that they belong to. If it's an umbrella organization, it's possible the money is being laundered through them to the subsidiary. Thus, again, laundering money and support is done specifically to conceal the source of the funding. So if you go to Global Investigative Journalism Network, which this Center for Investigative Journalism of Serbia is a part of, they admit that they're funded by Open Society, all of these other corporate, private foundations that work parallel to the National Endowment for Democracy. And it says, we are grateful for generous core support from founders such as Oak Foundation, the Open Society Foundations, Humanity United, the Reva and David Logan Foundation, the Luminate Group, Hug Morenz Foundation for Media Literacy, the Cottonwood Spring Foundation, and the Bay and Paul Foundations. And if you look all of them up, you will see how the tentacles all spread all across the US and European government. They're private and public fronts that they use to fund sedition all around the world. Now, getting back to the original Center for Investigative Journalism of Serbia, CINS. You look at some of the articles that they have published over the years. Party Funds Database, SNS. This is the party of current president of Serbia, Alexander Vučić, the financially strongest political party in Serbia. If you read through this, they make it sound like they're so shady and abusive and they've got all of this money and it's lopsidedly shifting power in their favor. It's unfair. Something should be done about this. So it instantly tells you, a flag should go up and say, these are US, European funded media outfits targeting and undermining the current government. Why would they do that? If that was their client regime of choice, why would they be doing that? There's also, again, another organization connected to Serbia involved in promoting the protests and targeting the current government and trying to undermine it. And that is the Balkan Investigative Reporting Network. And they're very straightforward about who funds them. The European Commission, the British Embassy in Belgrade, Open Society right there, even though they kind of, you gotta kind of squint, you can see it says Open Society Foundation, Serbia. Freedom House, which is a subsidiary of the NED. The NED itself, USAID is still listed there, even though it's been integrated into the State Department and this branding has been dispensed of. Transparency International, which again is just funded by this collection. It's a self-sustaining cycle where they're all funding each other. An Open Society funds Transparency International. That will fund a bunch of organizations co-funded by the National Endowment for Democracy. And you could spend all day, all week, all month digging into all of this. And you will see how extensive it is. And when you hear people say, Brian, you think the US is involved everywhere? Well, they literally are, and the evidence is there, and you could spend a lifetime documenting it and mapping it out. So those are the donors for BIRN, or BURN if you want to call it that. And they have a list of partners that fall under them. And it's all of these, there's a variety of organizations here, but there are specific ones that are media organizations. KRIK, K-R-I-K, DONUS. And if you go to their websites, and all you do is your browser probably has a translate to English function, just translate it and see what they're complaining about. And if they're sitting there supporting the protests and they're condemning Russia and they're promoting the protests and they're anti the current government, then you can safely conclude that that is the US government stance. Why would they be funding media organizations attacking a government that they themselves want to keep in power? That is how the color revolutions work. They have media, legal organizations, fake human rights groups that cover up the violence. They refuse to report on the violence of the protesters themselves, and they only report on the responses by the police and military. These are all the pieces that fall into place to make up a US engineered color revolution. This is literally what they've done to Serbia once already, and this is what they are doing again. And they're using the exact same method, albeit a little bit differently, but not much differently. And these are these specific, and I'm naming names and I'm showing you where their funding is coming from. These are the organizations that are involved promoting it. What about US government funded propaganda? Indisputably US government funded propaganda, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, which everyone thinks President Trump defunded and dismantled. This is from September 1st, 2025, yesterday. Back to school in Serbia, universities seek to break student boycott. And it's all about the heroic youths and students and how heroic they are, protesting the government, demanding change, demanding regime change. And so is very conclusive where the US government stands. You have the Guardian article clearly supporting the protests. They published the president's letter in response to what their official stance was on the protests, which was supporting them. Literally US government funded media, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. They support the protests, and all the NED Open Society funded media organizations in Serbia themselves support the protests. And another trick that you can use is you go to some of their websites. They don't update often. They have a heavy presence on social media. What you do is you look for, let's just type in KRIK. Here we go. Let's see what they say about the protests. Let's see if they're for or against the protests. And you can see they cross-post all of the groups listed on this list. You will see them cross-post. This is what the NED organizations do in Thailand, where I'm based. They all cross-post each other. It's all a self-referring network of US government-funded propaganda. And so Nuns is on there. If you look, they're on there, right here. Okay? That's how it all works. This is how it works everywhere. It's one playbook, every country. And this media organization in particular, they were the ones covering and digging into and investigating all the corruption surrounding the railway roof collapse that was used. And I'm not saying that's not a legitimate reason to be upset, but that they used that as cover to then push the color revolution forward. That's how they always do it. They do not hijack legitimate protests. They build illegitimate protests around legitimate issues. People are not just going to spontaneously come out and start burning their whole country down because a railway station collapsed. What sense does that even make? It doesn't make any sense. A railway station collapses, you're going to go out, burn things down, and get more people killed in response to it. What do you think you're going to achieve by doing that, especially looking at just Serbia's own recent history alone? What does that serve? Nothing. Serves nothing. Okay, so pinned at the very top of their profile is again, a story attacking Serbian President Alexander Vučić. It's about all of the corruption that they are using as a catalyst to get these protests going. And then they're going to use violence and the resulting casualties, injuries, and deaths to escalate it, just like they did in Ukraine, just like they did all across the Arab Spring. Again, all premeditated years in advance. These were not spontaneous protests the US swooped in and hijacked. Now, there are people, again, there are people who swear that President Alexander Vučić is a US puppet, pro-EU, pro-NATO. And these are people who are dissatisfied by the compromise and the game that he has been playing to try to balance Serbia between a desire to maintain its relationship with Russia and the rest of the world and the fact that it's completely surrounded by the Western world. And people don't understand that. Ordinary people don't understand that. They're extremely emotional. Many of them have a tendency towards a more extreme set of options that they haven't really thought through at all. These are the same people that claim Russian President Vladimir Putin is a traitor because he hasn't fired nuclear missiles at London and Washington over the ongoing conflict in Ukraine. These are people that don't think one or two steps ahead of whatever it is that pops into their brain. And I'm not saying that they're bad people, but it's just people that haven't given serious thought to these issues. They're reacting emotionally, just like the people who are getting sucked into these protests through US government-sponsored propaganda, the networks that I was just showing to you, mapping out. So Venezuela, false pretense to use the threat of US military force for regime change. Serbia, NED-funded organizations together with Open Society and EU-funded organizations promoting protests, attacking and undermining the current government in Serbia. Latin America, Europe, let's move to Southeast Asia. Indonesia, violent protests in Indonesia. Let's see what the Western media is saying about that. This was updated 4 hours ago. Today is September 2nd, 2025, as I'm recording this. Indonesia's deadly protests paused, but deep resentment remains. Here's what to know. Again, these people are coming out. They're burning their country to the ground over what? Over what? What does CNN say they're burning their country down to the ground and killing each other over? Indonesia's worst wave of violent protests in years seems to have come to a pause for now after the government ordered the military and police to take stern action against rioters and looters. And again, they're out literally burning things to the ground. So the police and military, it's their responsibility to stop them. That is not how you solve problems. You don't just go out and just start causing random violence. These people have no plan. They have no clue why they're even out onto on the streets. Honestly, they think they're there to fight government corruption or whatever the vague slogan is that they all are repeating. But that's not why they're out on the streets. They're out on the streets because the US government, through its network of propaganda in Indonesia, set up in the exact same manner it has been set up in Serbia and everywhere else, has convinced them to do so. And has leaders, media, organizations serving as a structure to draw out these people. People always argue with me, Brian, I was in the protests. I wasn't funded. That's how the NED works. They don't need to fund everyone. They just need to fund the leaders that convince you that this is a worthy cause of you going out for free and protesting. That is how it always works. So Indonesia's worst wave of violent protests, some students and civil society groups called off their protests. So it's not spontaneous, it's not organic, it's not grassroots. It is student organizations that are influenced by US programs in the universities all across Indonesia, just like they are here in Thailand, and civil society groups, which is just a euphemism for US NED-funded organizations. I will tell you by name what those organizations, some of them, are. So they called their protests off on Monday, so that was yesterday, citing fears of heightened security measures imposed after deadly riots across the country on the weekend, Reuters reported. At least 5 people have been killed in the protests. So again, wait until you find out what this was over and was it worth killing human beings over. It began peacefully over controversial housing perks for lawmakers, but erupted on Thursday when an armored vehicle hit and killed a rideshare driver. But again, what was going on? What was going on? This was what was going on. Violence in the streets, arson, property damage. People, and I've seen it with my own eyes here in Thailand because they did the exact same thing here on multiple occasions. The most recent was 2019 to 2020. They're out there throwing bricks at people's heads. They're burning down private property, also public property. They're lighting police vehicles on fire. They're lighting public buildings on fire. And if anyone in the public says, why are you doing this? You should stop doing this. They'll throw a brick at their head also. I've seen it. I've done entire videos about how this all works. They're doing this over housing perks for lawmakers. I understand that that is a reason to be upset. That is not a reason to go and burn your country to the ground. I understand there are lawmakers taking your tax money you feel they're not even doing a really good job at all, or even you suspect they're doing a horrible job, and they're taking your tax money and they're giving themselves additional benefits while you feel you're struggling because of their incompetence. Fair enough, you're upset about that. Is that a reason for people to just spontaneously come out of their homes and we all just so happen to gather at this one police station to burn it down? No, that is not how it works. But we get a little clue from CNN. CNN gives us a little hint of who is behind this, because the civil society groups that are running it and called it off temporarily, they get interviewed, they get named. CNN names them. It's buried in the article. They hope you don't make the connection or look into them, but they do name them from time to time. So there's a man named Daniel. He's the representative for the Jakarta Legal Aid Institute. Whenever you hear some organization named like that, you could almost bet anything without even looking into it that it's NED-funded. They all have almost identical names. Here in Thailand, they have Thai Lawyers for Human Rights. This is just a copy and pasted Indonesian version of Thai Lawyers for Human Rights. He said, much of the discontent centered around the worsening economic hardships for ordinary Indonesians as wages stagnate and living costs rise. So let's all burn our country to the ground. That's how you solve that problem, right? Now, Jakarta Legal Aid Institute has been named in almost every article. If you do a search, you will see their names in CNN, in Reuters, Financial Times. All of these articles cite them specifically, because that's how all of these color revolutions work. They're not going to just randomly interview people and do real journalism. They're going to interview the people the US government and European governments are funding to destabilize these countries, because the media also plays a direct role in this. Western media plays a direct role in promoting the local media and local protesting groups that are engaged in US color revolution. So they're always going to cite the Western funded agitators themselves. They're not going to actually do real journalism and interview random people and see, what do people supporting the protest think? What do people opposed to the protest think? And we'll give you an unbiased, balanced view and let you decide. No, they just always interview the US government-funded agitators. So what does Jakarta Legal Aid Institute do? They give free legal aid to all of the agitators and protest leaders as they carry out their violent foreign government-funded sedition and treason inside Indonesia. That's what they do. Who funds them? If you go to their website, they don't tell you who funds them. And these so-called civil society organizations that want freedom and democracy, always demanding transparency from their respective governments, they themselves exercise almost always zero transparency themselves. As you do a little bit of digging like I did, you will find this Ford Foundation, and all the Ford Foundation is another CIA cutout like the NED itself, and they will fund organizations and movements that the US government itself does not want to be caught funding directly. And so they name it by name, Indonesia Legal Aid Foundation. This is an umbrella group that Jakarta Legal Aid falls under, and this is who they receive their funding from. This is what they claim they're doing: general to promote justice, democracy, and human rights across all layers of society through empowerment of marginalized groups. Again, this idea of identity politics that divide and destroy society, improvement of systems, institutions, and advocacy for legal justice, and core support for institutional strengthening. This is the sovereign business of a nation. No other nation has the right to meddle in this. This is for the people of Indonesia themselves and themselves alone to determine, not the US government, whether it's directly through the National Endowment for Democracy or their fronts like the Ford Foundation. Who else has funded this group? If you go to another archived webpage, this is from 2004, Indonesia Legal Aid Foundation, struggling for democracy and its own sustainability, because this is the problem. When they get found out and exposed, the NED or USAID, whoever was funding them, when they get found out, is like a hot potato. They have to pass it to somebody else. But luckily for the United States, they have a global spanning network of client states that they can pass this hot potato off to. Who gets it? Who gets it after USAID? Novum and USAID no longer provide support. Okay, so they were supporting it. Who does now? Canadian International Development Agency, which is just Canada's USAID, and Australia's Agency for International Development, which is just Australia's USAID. That's who's funding this Indonesian group that all the Western media groups are taking turns citing. And this is one of the groups behind the protests, supporting the protests, literally providing free legal aid to the people engaged in US-sponsored sedition in Indonesia. Now, again, just like with Serbia, a way you can figure out what these organizations are doing now specifically regarding the protests is to go look at their social media presence. You go to one of these other fake fronts the US government and European governments are funding, and what is this? Just a moment. I think it's this one. So what is this? This is a demand, stop police brutality. So they're condemning the Indonesian government, they're condemning the Indonesian police, and they have this little letter that they've written, and all of these groups signed it, including the Indonesian Legal Aid Foundation that I was just talking about, that the Western media has been citing regarding the protests. And if you look at this list, some of these I know by name already without even having to look them up, because they're here in Thailand. The Manusia Foundation even says right here, Thailand. These are one of the fake fronts funded by the US government here in Thailand, engaged in sedition and treason, essentially treason. You're working for a foreign government to destroy your own country. How else do you put it? It's an ugly word, but what other word can you use? And they even have down here the Milk Tea Alliance. I've done entire videos about the Milk Tea Alliance. That is a US State Department project. That was to Southeast Asia, well, actually Asia in general, what the Arab Spring was to the Arab world. This is a region-wide effort by the State Department to network all of their groups in individual countries together to try to create a wave of chaos, division, and destruction all across Asia. Then you have to ask yourself, why are they doing this? Serbia has a relationship with Russia. The US wants to stop and extinguish completely and completely subordinate it to itself and its European client states. The US wants to destroy all of Southeast Asia, to encircle and contain China, not just with the US military, but with socioeconomic chaos, that China is isolated and more easily managed by the US as it continues its open confrontation with China itself. So that's why they're doing all of this. And I will put the link to the Milk Tea Alliance video that I have done previously, so you can watch through that. And I have a list of links in the video description of that video where you can go and see all of the evidence. Here, Solidarity Collective. And again, you look up any of these and you will see the US government funding behind all of them. Here's another one. This is on the list. It's called 2030 Youth Force Indonesia, and this is their webpage, 2030 Youth Force Activity. It's a dead giveaway that it's a Western-funded fake front when everything is in English. How is this supposed to appeal to ordinary Indonesians? And the way you figure this out is you look in the, you got to be a little bit of a detective, because most of them lie about their foreign funding and they cover it up. But they always go to these events, or they organize these events, and you can see in the background Western corporations, Western controlled institutions, UN volunteers, and all of these other groups that the US government and Europe are funding. Google, we know for a fact, works directly with the US State Department years before the Arab Spring to organize these type of color revolutions. Google is directly involved. Facebook, now called Meta, directly involved. Twitter, now X, also involved, also playing a part in this, doing at least at the minimum, doing nothing to expose and stop it. Another organization on that list, essentially backing the protests and condemning the Indonesian government and police, is an organization called Indonesia Justice and Peace Foundation. I will show it to you right here. Right here, Indonesia Justice and Peace Foundation. You just go through and you just spot check them. I guarantee you the majority of them are going to be US government funded. One way or the other, they'll be US government funded. And so what is the connection between Indonesia Justice and Peace Foundation and the US government? Well, they're openly collaborating with a group literally called American Friends Service Committee, and they pass themselves off as some religious organization, but of course they publish annual reports. You just go here and you click on 2024, and they have a whole list of organizations that are funding them. Named endowment. So you just go through these. You go through these and you just search each one. And I mean, an obvious one is right here, Tides Foundation, which is connected to Soros's Open Society. But I'm going to just to make this, to show you how extensive all of this is. This network is extremely extensive. I will name you the organizations funding this religious front in America, located in America, supporting this group in Indonesia, backing the current protests. United Nations Peacebuilding Fund funds this American-based group supporting this Indonesian group. This is how they do it without being caught. They launder the money through various layers of public and private fronts. They know ordinary people are never going to take the time to trace back to their origin. So the United Nations Peacebuilding Fund is obvious. The US government captures and controls many aspects of the United Nations and its various funds. The Victims of Crime Act is literally a US federal government program. Go look it up. Kids in Need of Defense works directly with the US government, the Department of Homeland Security and the Department of Health, legal and immigration systems, the US government's legal and immigration systems. The Community Alliance with Family Farmers, it receives federal grants from multiple US government agencies, including the Agricultural Marketing Service and the National Resources Conservation Service. And the list goes on and on and on. And you can do this. You can go and look these up, and you can see the US government is involved in absolutely every level of this. And they launder the money through layers to these organizations, hoping that nobody sees it. And they get angry when you see people calling it a US-sponsored color revolution. They say, it's not, it's organic, it's grassroots. When there is a stack of documents that if you printed them out, it would go to the ceiling, proving that this is US government funded. Now, who else? What other media? I said, always check the media groups. So let's check some media groups. Remote TV. This is based in Indonesia. Right here, it says Indonesia. Project Multatuli, Indonesia. Okay? And let's just take a look at some of their posts and see what they're saying. If you're familiar with this particular color revolution funded by the US government in Indonesia, and you see things like this, this is a Japanese anime series called One Piece. And if you're familiar with US funded color revolutions, especially because they target the youth, they always try to give it some sort of clever pop culture tie-in. So in Indonesia, it's One Piece. Here in Thailand, it was the Hunger Games and Harry Potter. In Myanmar, maybe because it is only one playbook and they were lazy that day, they also used the Hunger Games in Myanmar. So what does this post here say? It says, the mass action that has occurred since August 25th, 2025 is not solely due to the mouth, behavior, and policies of the DPR. They're complaining about the government. And this is basically saying it's not just about the housing allowances. It's about many other things. And that is how every US-sponsored color revolution works. They pick one thing that people would say, well, that's actually something you should be upset about. They take that and they use that as the pretext to get the protests going. They're always violent. Then they use the casualties as a reason to escalate and expand the protests. And then they start going into other things. And it always ends up with regime change. That is always the end goal, is regime change. Get whoever's in power out and get someone the US wants in power in. And this organization, Project Multatuli, and this one, Remote TV, both from Indonesia, both media organizations, we know for a fact that they are funded by the US National Endowment for Democracy because they themselves said so. We know that they are funded by the US government because they complained about it earlier this year. Without us, no scrutiny. Indonesia's independent media, there's that term again, count cost of US funding cuts. So if you're getting funded by the US government, you're not really independent media, are you? US funding cuts abruptly ended reporting initiatives on environmental issues in Indonesia affecting independent journalism outlets like Remote TV, New Narrative, and Project Multatuli. And I just showed you, they're both supporting the current protests. They're both sharing images with the One Piece flag. Let's go to the One Piece flag. And let's just make it even more obvious still. Here's a BBC article specifically about the cartoon symbol. How a cartoon skull became a symbol of defiance in Indonesia. And they've got a cute little article like this for every US engineered color revolution going all the way back to the Arab Spring. They had cute little articles like this about Thailand, about how they're using the Hunger Games and Harry Potter, and now it's One Piece. So it says, in the popular Japanese anime One Piece, black flags bearing a skull with a straw hat are carried by a rowdy crew of pirates who have been made in their mission to challenge a draconian regime and fight for freedom. So you could already see how that obviously was not these youths coming up with that themselves. It was a US government marketing team. The same one that comes up with these same, almost identical in concept symbols. Going all the way back to Serbia when they overthrew Milosevic, they had the clenched fist, and that was the graffiti symbol that they spray painted all across the country to identify the US-funded regime change with. But in July, these emblems started popping up across Indonesia along doorways, on the back of cars, and painted on walls. And you can see the three-finger salute from Hunger Games still on cars and on people's shirts here in Thailand. It was a real successful branding exercise by the US government. And painted on walls, again, just like in Serbia, the clenched fist. For many, they were a response to the Indonesian leader. So they're talking about the president. He called on Indonesians to fly their national red and white flag ahead of the country's Independence Day on August 17th. Could you imagine your country was literally colonized by the West, who divided, destroyed, raped, and robbed your country for decades? You get independence from them, and then you're going to fly a one-piece pirate flag to spite your government on Independence Day for a movement that is literally funded by the same type of Western interests that colonized your country in the first place. And the West loves doing that. That's what they are still doing. That's what they have done for centuries. That is still what they're literally doing right now. It continues. Instead, some Indonesians chose to raise these pirate flags known as Jolly Rogers as a symbol of their discontent, with many criticizing what they say is an increasingly centralized government led by the presidents. But the movement has not been well received by all. Earlier last week, the country's deputy House Speaker criticized the flag displays, calling them an attempt to divide the nation, obviously. Another lawmaker even suggested it could be treason. Definitely. The whole point of these color revolutions, you will never see them be patriotic about their own country. It's always about creating a separate identity from what that country actually exists as, creating it separate and drawing more people over to it, and then pitting it against everyone else. And then creating a self-sustaining strategy of tension to burn the whole country to the ground. This is literally what the British Empire, and before that, the Roman Empire, did to regions and nations that it targeted for conquest. And that is what the United States is still doing. They're using the exact same tactics, albeit updated for the 21st century, and sharpened with modern marketing techniques. But that is what they are trying to do. So that's why they don't want Indonesians flying Indonesian flags on Independence Day. They want them flying a completely different flag. And other people are going to see that, and that's going to put them off, and it's going to create division. And that's exactly what you want. Why is Indonesia in the crosshairs of the United States yet again? They joined BRICS, and this president that they're trying to oust from power was supposed to be at the Shanghai Cooperation Organization meeting this month. He had to cancel it because of the violent protests. This is straightforward as that. If a nation has an independent foreign policy, the United States government wants to crush it, wants to divide and destroy it, politically capture it if it can, but leave it as a failed state if it must. Because that is how one nation, one small group, handful of special interests can control the rest of the planet, by dividing and pitting everyone else against each other. Within a nation and between nations. Within a region and between regions. That is how empire has always functioned. That is how the modern American empire functions. And this is how they are doing it. I showed you the groups involved. I showed you their funding. I showed you the groups in Indonesia themselves admitting that they are independent media funded by the US government. Without US government money, they can't continue doing their work. How do they represent the average Indonesian if the Indonesian people themselves are not even willing to support their work? They have to get all their money from a foreign government, literally on the other side of the planet. Ask yourself that. So this is why every nation in the multipolar world needs to pass strict NGO laws that identify, defund, and dismantle these US and European funded networks. This is modern day imperialism, alive and well, and literally dividing and destroying countries around the world. Right now as we talk, Serbia and Indonesia, just two examples, and Venezuela is an example of the US just outright threatening it with overt military force and regime change. These nations also need to reform and protect their information space. I talk about information space as a modern domain of national security, just like your land border, your sea, your shores, and your airspace, your information space is a national security domain that needs to be protected just as carefully as all of your physical domains. If you're not protecting your information space in the 21st century, it's the same as in the 20th century, not having an air force protecting your airspace. You will be easy prey for another nation's aggression and machinations. You also need to create pipelines to train lawyers, journalists, policymakers, and professors to reflect their nation's best interests, not the West's best interests. They should not be going over to the West and studying and then coming back, because what happens is they are indoctrinated, they are plugged into personal and professional social networks, and when they come back, they're still serving those networks and those interests from the West, not their own nation. So these pipelines need to be created inside these countries for these countries. And then from being educated in the country to reflect their own nation's best interests, you have to bring these people into the media, the legal system, and especially the education system, and of course the government itself of the country. You should not have foreign educated people running absolutely everything in a country in, say, Southeast Asia on the other side of the planet. It doesn't even make sense when you really think about it. Now, if protesters want to actually fight about something, let them fight about what that pipeline looks like, because that is how you fix the problems in your country. You create a pipeline that creates qualified people to do these jobs in the media, in education, and in the government. All of these things you complain are inadequate. You create a pipeline that creates qualified people that are actually capable of doing these jobs. You can fight over what that pipeline looks like and the type of people that it produces. What you do not do is go out into the streets and help burn your country down based on narratives and stories and accusations made by media organizations that admit themselves they're literally funded by the US government and cannot do their work without continued US government funding. And of course, they're obviously still being funded by the US government because they're still doing their work. And right now, their work is to promote these protests and attack the current Indonesian government. And the same goes for Serbia. And finally, most important, when you see these protests unfolding, do not try to listen to rhetoric and decipher Western media headlines. Identify the groups that are involved and follow where their funding leads back to. If it leads back to the National Endowment for Democracy, then case closed. It is a US government-sponsored color revolution. That is what's going on in Serbia and in Indonesia. Case closed. You want to argue all that you want, that I don't like the president, he's a bad guy. That might be, but the US government is funding these protests, and they're burning these two countries down right now as we speak. Figure it out, expose it, speak up about it. If you want to see a brighter future for Serbia, Indonesia, or any other country for that matter, you need to stop the US from dismembering it first before they can go about solving any actual problem you think they have and moving forward in a better direction. I'm going to end it right there. I'm going to continue keeping an eye on all of these hotspots. Venezuela, Serbia, Indonesia, anywhere else US meddling rears its ugly head. If you thought this video was useful, please like and share. Think about subscribing. It's free to do. It helps the channel grow. Check the video description below for all of the links that I referenced. All the NED funding I linked in the video description below. Check the video description below for all of those links. If you don't believe me, it's actually much more extensive than that. This is as much as I can fit into a video. There are also ways you can help support my work. Unlike all of these fake media groups in Serbia and in Indonesia, I'm not funded by a foreign government. I solely depend on my audience to support my work. They are very generous in supporting my work. I greatly appreciate that. You can do that through Buy Me a Coffee or through Patreon, whether it's a one-time donation, donations month to month, or if you don't have any resources at all, please don't apologize for not being able to support me financially. Just helping share my work and getting the word out there about all of this information, that is help enough. I greatly appreciate all of that. All of that is what makes this work possible. So thank you again. And as always, thank you for watching.